Okay, hello folks. We're getting on the hour, so I think we'll kind of get started. So welcome to this afternoon or this morning, wherever you are in the world, PL SQL Office Hours session. Great to see you all. We've also got Stephen here. Say hi, Stephen. He's going to give always waving at us.
Sure, I'll say hi. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad you could join us for the latest session, and I'm going to hand it over to Chris to do all the heavy lifting. I'll just poke my nose in and ask really irritating questions. As should you do as well.
Yes.
Well, not irritating, but helpful.
Yes. Well, if you're unsure about any of the things we're talking about, or hopefully have some time on the end, got general questions about PL SQL, please put them in chat. We'll be keeping an eye on them and see what's going on. But for the most of this session today, we're going to be talking about edition-based redefinition. So let's kind of get started. Now, I really like PL SQL. Its tight integration with SQL gives a lot of performance and security benefits, which make it perfect language for doing a lot of, or most of your data processing. However, it does have an Achilles heel, or traditionally it's had one, in that you could only have one copy of a given PL SQL object in a given schema, which brought an interesting challenge for some of you if you've got really high uptime requirements. How the heck do we get this stuff live, right? So as soon as you recompile a PL SQL package, that change is visible to everyone. And if you're doing this change while the application is still running, that brings a whole bunch of challenges. Fortunately, we brought in a technology is about just over 10 years ago now, around 10 years ago, EBR, edition-based redefinition, which helps solve this problem. So that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at some of the challenges around deploying PL SQL, why only having one copy of your objects causes all these issues, and discuss possible solutions and look at why EBR is fantastic. And if you have any amount of PL SQL in your application, as far as I'm concerned, you should just use it. Okay, so standard disclaimer before we begin. Let's get started. Now, if you've got your applications up and running, when you do a deployment, it's nice to make sure that actually you release the correct thing, and it all works. You got the right stuff out of source control and deployed it. There was no major bugs which somehow magically slipped through QA, and there's no tiny differences between your staging environment and your production environment, which mean that the release fail. So it's nice to be able to do those double checks before all your customers actually see this. But as I said, if you're doing this while your application's online, as soon as you compile that, they can see those changes. And if it's all gone horribly wrong, there's a good chance that Twitter is going to tell you you've got a problem with your application before you find out yourself. It's not a good situation to be in, right? It's not good personally, I'm sure. I don't want to be deploying something that goes wrong. I don't want, I want to make sure that the things actually work, but also the wider company probably aren't going to be happy for being headline news for the wrong reasons. The application is broken. So it's nice to be able to just kind of double check, see that everything's worked before you actually unleash it on your real customers. But because we've only got one copy of our package available, as soon as we compiled it, everyone can see it. So this creates a problem for us. And there's some, but even if the release works, hopefully the release failing is a relatively rare occurrence. If every other release is failing, you've got bigger issues to deal with here, right? But there's still the problem of what happens if someone uses your application partway through the release. Typically with a database release, you don't just change one thing. You might create and alter a couple of tables, deploy some PL SQL packages, and maybe run some DML. From the time the release starts to the time release finishes, who knows what's going to happen, right? There could be all sorts of transient errors. Temporary invalidations are one of the most common situations where a package, there's a dependency and you've invalidated, compile the package, which invalidates another one, which will be subsequently recompiled as part of your changes. So anyone who happens to be unlucky enough to access your application in that exact moment is going to get some errors. But there could also be kind of logical errors as different ways the code calls each other. Maybe some data is not in place correctly because you haven't run the DML scripts you need to. So there's all sorts of weird stuff which could happen. And the fact is, you kind of don't necessarily know. To really know what's going to happen, you have to test your application after every single thing you do in your release, which, it's not really feasible if you're changing more than a couple of things. Most of us struggle to do a full test of the application for the complete release, never mind after each individual stage. So this isn't, doing this intermediate testing isn't really possible. So there's a couple of challenges there. Things might go wrong, but even if the release is all fine, which hopefully most of the time it is, it's very likely that people get errors using your application partway through the release. And to help kind of mitigate these problems, what a lot of kind of large-scale companies like to do, or internet-facing companies, is concept of rolling releases. This is where you deploy your change to a small subset of your users, say 5% of them. Verify, check everything's all working fine. When you're sure it is, then roll it out to 10%, then 20%, and so on, until gradually everyone is using the new version of the application. This kind of helps mitigate your risk. If somehow major bugs did slip through your testing process, you've only affected a small number of your actual users. But this, again, requires you to kind of have two copies of your application, the current live version and the new one that you're migrating people to. And if you've just got one copy of a PL/SQL package, well, it's tricky to do, right? Now, you could do things like have all sorts of conditional logic, parameters which say, if version 1, do this, if version 2, do that. But that's just messy, really tricky to manage. So in theory, you might be able to do something a bit like this, but it's really just not plausible for most PL/SQL changes. So this isn't truly possible. And there's another practical problem that you might run into. When someone is executing a PL/SQL unit, so the package or procedure, whatever, you are unable to compile it. You cannot get the DDL lock to actually change that object, which kind of makes sense. Someone else is actually using it. We can't change it until they've finished using it. If your application is popular enough, I'm willing to bet that there are some core packages or core procedures which are executed basically always, right? They're always in use. And so effectively, the only way to actually be able to release them is take some kind of brief outage, actually stop people being able to access that package completely so you can actually compile your changes. So there may actually be a practical limitation here stopping you doing a release. So there's a whole bunch of challenges here, and it all relates to the fact we've only got one copy of this package, procedure, whatever it is, in our schema. And this, but how did we solve this traditionally? Well, what we do is just take an outage, right? You say, we'll take an outage, shut down the application, do our release, double check as best we can that everything's working fine. And then once we're happy, everything's worked to the best of our knowledge, we'll then bring it back up online again. And actually, for some of us, this is still potentially feasible. Just let us know. And I'm interested to know how many people can actually take an outage of, say, an hour or more at least once a month. So if you can, just let us know in chat and say yes, we can take an outage. And if you can't, just say no, we've got high uptime requirements. Because I'm curious to see how many people, where you are in this kind of outage window requirements for this. You got any comments at this point, Stephen?
Well, I was just going to write that so you and I both work on the DevGem. I'm the backend developer. Chris mostly is our SQL database design quizmaster. And I've got to say, in the DevGem, we can afford to take the site down, because while people don't like it when they can take their quiz when they were ready to, it's not the end of the world. So I work in a class of applications in which it's not the end of the world if it goes down. And of course, the big thing there is we're not taking money on the site. And usually that's where you get into the issues of downtime, right? Where every second is monetized. So remind me, Chris, as people are answering this question, what does yes mean? Yes means we can afford downtime, or we
Yes,
can afford downtime?
we can take regular outages, and no
Okay.
means either, very few or almost no outages. And we're talking scheduled outages where you say, we've got a planned change, we can't, we know we want to take it offline for a period. So it seems quite a few people can do it a few times. Sven's pointed out we've got little yes, no icons we can click here. I keep forgetting about those. Okay, so, comment, we used to take 24 outages every 3 months for big and complex releases. Yeah, so that's the thing a lot of companies get forced into do. They would have a quarterly or biannual release window where it's very big outage, and you just try and stuff as much stuff into it as possible, right? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So yeah, thanks for your comments, guys. And comment from Mark. Yes, we could take an outage, but have to do it at the weekends. I think that's the thing. Even if you are able to take an outage, quite often it's at inconvenient times, right? Early in the morning or at the weekends, or early in the morning at the weekend. So, I don't know about the rest of you, but I don't want to be up at 3 a.m. on Sunday morning worrying about whether a database release has worked, right? I'd much rather be asleep. Or if I'm going to be awake, I don't want to be thinking about whether the release has actually worked or not. So even if we can do it, it tends to be inconvenient. And actually, there's another problem as well. So you can do this release, but then everything looks fine. You bring the application back up online, and things are going okay. But then, you've done it at 3 a.m., 10 a.m., 11 a.m. the next morning, or that later that morning, when you're reaching peak activity for the application, things start to go wrong. Things start to break. And now you're in a situation where it's kind of like, we need to call an emergency rollback. Maybe there was some bug which looked okay at first, but somehow has escalated into a major problem. Much more likely is there's some kind of performance issue which is tricky to spot in your testing and staging environments. Something unexpected is going wrong, and now everyone's trying to use your application. It's really busy, and you need to revert back to the old version to get everything up and running again. So this is now not a great situation to be in, because previously you took that quiet time when the application was quiet enough, or the business agreed that it was quiet enough. You could take an outage, you had your luxury of your time to do your release, make sure it worked, give yourself time to roll back if it failed. Now it's like rush, 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 everything's falling apart. There's probably people panicking, running around going, why the heck isn't it working? If this is a money-taking application, there'll be parts of your sales, marketing, finance team kind of going, what the heck's going on? We're losing money, sort it out. Stressful, not good to be in, and then it becomes much tougher to make sure everything's working properly. So even if you could take that outage, you may be forced to do releases in terms of rollback when the application's still actually live. And it's worth remembering rollback could be called for business reasons as well. So, we think, okay, in IT terms, maybe there's a bug, maybe there's a performance issue, but what about the sales and marketing team? They come up with some fancy new idea for the website. They're convinced it's going to make $1 million a day. Customers are going to love it. It's going to save the company. Turns out it's not the case at all. Customers hate it, so they want to yank that change back out really quickly. Conversions are just tanking. So again, the business might decide that you need to revert your change. Now, there are ways to handle this that don't involve actually rolling back your database changes, and it's worth looking into those, parameterizing changes and so on. But there will be cases where you do actually need to roll back application changes to go back to old business functionality. So even if we've done our job perfectly in IT, the business might go, hang on, we don't want this anymore. We made the wrong choice. Take us back. So there's a few comments coming in here. Let's just have a look at them. So Dennis, important point here, it's not all about the downtime. The most crucial stuff is how smooth the patch is applied, and if we have a way back and retest the functionality. But it seems Chris already said about that. Yeah, I think that's a great point, Dennis, and it's kind of what I'm saying here about this emergency rollback, it's not just doing it without downtime, but making sure it all works and it will continue to work, and you've got an easy way to get back out of it if things go wrong. Okay, comments from Sven. My experience with outages for medium, large-sized companies have a web presence or 24/7 stuff running. Finding time for outages is a major problem. For very large companies, the situation turns around. DBA teams are outsourced and they do the outage whenever they want. The local user cannot argue with them anymore and just suffers. That's probably a fair point. You know, I know there's some sites occasionally I use in the US, and they use outages in, you know, overnight on Saturday, so Saturday into through to Sunday morning, which is overnight for them, but for me it's Sunday morning when I tend to like do some of these tasks, and then I can't use their application. It's like, yeah. So yeah, you're right. For true global companies, quite often we just have to suffer, don't we? Anyone got any other comments on outages and so on before we go on? Okay, well, we'll keep an eye on the chat window, so just let us know if you've got any other war stories or thoughts on this. Okay, so as I said, the whole fundamental problem here is that we've only got one copy of a particular object. So if you've got your package, customers package, as soon as you recompile that with the new changes, it's visible to everyone using the database. And the basic solution is to be able to have two copies of it. You've got your live one the customers are accessing and the new one that you're deploying. And this is something people have been able to do at the kind of application tier basically forever. You know, nowadays you'd spin up a new virtual machine or a new cloud compute instance, deploy to that, check everything's fine, and then migrate people from the old instances to the new. Even back in, or maybe way back when, you could actually have separate executables, you know, install them side by side, check that they work. So there's a whole stack of ways to solve this kind of at the application tier, and this is because applications don't have state. Whereas databases are all about state. You've got to preserve exactly what you're doing. So having two copies of things is kind of tricky. And the PL SQL lives in the database. So what do we do? So there's various techniques I just kind of want to run through quickly. I'm sure some of you have either tried these or thought about these at least to some extent. And the first one, which seems like deceptive, brilliant genius, but as you play it out, you quickly realize it's not, is to rename your objects. So let's imagine we've got a little simple application here. We've got a view, which is referenced by a package, which is referenced by a procedure. And when we're doing a change, instead of changing that object itself, we'll create a new version of it with a number on the end saying which version of it is. So I'm making a change to the view here. I'm going to add a column to the select list, for example. So instead of recompiling the view itself, I will create a new object called view2. There we go. So this is now an independent object, so I can work away on it and do whatever I want. However, we now need to get all the other code to actually reference this new view. So we've got to change the code in the package to use the view to point to view2, which means we're changing the package, so we've got to rename that. And then we've got to do the same with the procedure. So one tiny change here has meant we've had to redeploy the entire application, which is a bit of a faff. But things get a bit more interesting when it comes to changing stuff at the top of this call stack here. So let's imagine we're changing the procedure. I'm going to change that to procedure 3. And this is pointing back to package 2. And this will just work. You know, we don't need to do anything else. We just need to change whatever the client is to come access this procedure. But you do this, you very, very quickly end up in kind of dependency hell, where all sorts of things point to different version numbers, and it's just really tricky to know what the heck's going on. Let's say I'm making a change to this view now. Well, which is the live version? What else do I have to change, and what do I change it to if this happens? If there's two people working on the same package at the same time, how do we assign version numbers? Yeah, it's not particularly obvious. So anytime you make a change to avoid this kind of into the dependencies where things are pointing at different version numbers and it's hard to see what's accessing what. Any change, doesn't matter what it is, if you're following this, really, you have to redeploy your entire application again. Change every single object, give it a new version number, and update all the references so they do this. It's just not feasible. I mean, maybe if your application is just these 3 objects here, you might get away with it. From experience, if you've got, it's very rare to have this few objects in an application. So, it's just a nightmare, right? Renaming and redeploying all your code for any change, no matter how trivial, quickly gets a mess. So it sounds brilliant, but this has a lot of problems. Okay, so we thought about this, and I've actually lived through this. It is pretty horrible. So if anyone else has tried this, I'd be interested to know and see how you got on with it. Got on with kind of renaming your objects. Oh, okay. So so this is because we can only have one copy of an object in a given schema. However, you can actually have multiple schemas which have objects with the same name. The namespace is schema name.object name. So we could actually have 2 schemas, each of which have the same objects in them. So another way to approach this is to actually have 2 PL/SQL schemas pointing at your data. So you've got all our tables existing in one schema at the bottom, and we've got 2 schemas on top of that, PL/SQL 1 or A or whatever you want to call it. And this will be the one the customers are currently using. When we come to do a release, we will come and deploy the changes into PL/SQL 2 or B or whatever. Do our changes there, make sure it's all working and we're happy everything's fine. And then when we have a process to cut people over from 1 to 2. And this solves a lot of the renaming problems, at least from a development perspective. So you don't need to go and redeploy all your code. You only need to change, actually compile what's actually changed. There are some challenges around managing this with schema changes as well. What if you make some table changes in your data? How does that work across schemas? It's possible to solve these, but they can be a bit awkward. And then there's so it solves some of the development stuff, but it does introduce some kind of process release organizational challenges. First up, you now need to do every single PL/SQL release twice, right? So we've done it on PL/SQL 2. We've migrated people from 1 to 2. All the customers are now working on the new version. You then need to deploy the code back on the old version. So you need to do every release twice. And it can be easy to miss this step, particularly if you end up having that rush through hotfix just to get something out. And these schemas could start gradually drifting apart over time. So they end up with slightly different definitions. And every now and again, you probably end up with a situation where you've just got to trash one of the schemas and clone it from the other and start again fresh, make sure everything's in sync. So that's one problem. The other problem is migrating the applications over. First up, how do you do this? Now, you could have something like a 4th schema on top of this with synonyms to switch between the 2. That might work, but it might not. Then it's likely you're going to have multiple applications pointing at these schemas. Usually, you have more than one application accessing your data schema or your PL/SQL. You've got to potentially go through all the connections for all of those and update them, which again, it's one of those tasks that can get overlooked, and you end up with half your applications over here and half your applications over here, and again, then you're just kind of in a mess. So this solves a lot of the development problems that renaming your objects has, but it brings a lot of operational problems, which are trickier to solve, and you really need to be really good with your processes to avoid these kind of things creeping in and catching you out. Okay, so we've talked about multiple schemas, you could go up another level again and say, well, we'll have multiple databases. We actually have two databases operating side by side. And we've got our live database and our to-be live. We deploy our changes to our to-be live, migrate people over. So we're replicating the databases between each other. And for most people, this is just kind of a non-starter. It kind of has all the kind of process problems we just talked about for having two schemas, but it introduces a whole bunch of extra complexity in terms of how do you, keep these databases in sync, how are you replicating them? We're not talking about something like data guard where you're just copying the database and failing it over. They both need to be up and running active at the same time, and some kind of bidirectional replication. It's going to be expensive, however you do it, and it's going to be complicated. So most people just don't even consider this. Okay, so I see there's some comments that Stephen's put from Dennis coming in, and
I think
go on.
Out of them, Chris, so I can go through a couple quickly, and then I left the third one for you. So in April, Bryn Llewellyn, who is the PL SQL product manager, as well as the EBR product manager, left Oracle. And the PM organization has not yet assigned a replacement for Bryn. So for now, if you have questions or comments about EBR, contact Chris or myself, and we'll check in with the PM and development teams as needed, and hopefully get your answer relatively quickly. In terms of plans to enhance EBR further, Chris, you might have heard something, but besides ongoing fixes and small changes that they've been making, I don't know about any big ticket new features. So if you do have ideas, if you've been using or trying to use EBR and there's something that has stopped you or you need to be different, let us know, and you can do so on this call or afterwards. And then finally, the one for you, Chris. Do you consider making additions as schema objects instead of database-wide objects? This would allow different applications on the same database, but in different schemas, to use their own additions without interfering with each other.
Okay, so I'm guessing that's kind of saying have each schema have separate additions rather than an addition per database. I think that's an interesting question, Dennis. I think we'll probably pick that up a bit later on, because there's some other things kind of relevant to that, I think, which we can discuss on later. So keep that in mind, and we'll address it later on. That's all right. Okay, so these were a whole bunch of challenges that you might have when it comes to trying to create two copies of your application, and they all have a huge number of drawbacks and are just kind of infeasible for most people. So you've got a comment from Judith. There were several enhancements in 12c which are usually less discussed in presentations, so maybe we could have a separate session on a few examples of those. I guess maybe we could talk a bit about some of the 12c stuff. I think they're a bit more detailed features rather than, big ticket options. I'm not sure if you've got any more insight there, Stephen, but
I don't offhand, but also the main thing we wanted to focus on in this session is not so much the edge aspects and cases of using EBR, but how you can use it in a very simple, straightforward way when all you're doing is updating your packages, your PL SQL Pro objects. Once you get into table changes, then you get into much more complex situations, which EBR handles. But we feel like developers start to look at the whole picture and get really intimidated and pushed away from even trying EBR. So the point for today is to really focus on, look, you can just get going with your PL SQL stuff and get some clear benefits out of it, and then perhaps ease into the rest of it.
So great points. Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Okay, so as we're kind of saying, a lot of these existing options or pre-EBR options for having two or more copies of your PL SQL available for your application are just impractical or infeasible for a whole bunch of reasons. So this drove some people, big companies with really high uptime requirements, to the conclusion that makes Stephen really sad: just have no database, no compiled PL SQL in the database. And it's so this could mean one of two things. It could mean just no PL SQL whatsoever, or it it could just mean having anonymous blocks of PL SQL pasted directly in your Java code or your C# code or whatever it is. Neither of these are ideal. Obviously, if you're not using PL SQL at all, you're losing all the benefits of it. Anonymous blocks do retain some of the performance and security advantages, but they lose most, if not all, of the developer productivity benefits, things like code reuse, having packages that you can reference by multiple bits of code, the data dictionary analysis to see what your dependencies are, PL scope to understand how your variables are used and things like that. So anonymous blocks pasted in your mid-tier language, whatever that happens to be, can work, but it does lose a lot of the advantages you get from having PL SQL compiled in the database. So this led people to, fortunately, EBR came along and it solved the problem. Gave us a simple, as Stephen was saying, easy way to allow PL SQL to be used in the database. So,
and Chris, before you move on, Sven had a suggestion, which I think is a good idea, to see who, if anyone on this call, is already using EBR or has tried it.
Yes.
And actually, again, if you go to the participant box, you can click on yes or no if you'd like to, in terms of registering your vote, or just put something in the chat. Is anybody on the call currently using or tried to use EBR?
Yes, so please let us know, yes or no. Have you done that? It'll be interesting to see. A few yeses, more no's, which doesn't surprise me. Yes, no, okay. Okay, so yeah, the no's seem to be outnumbering the yeses, which is not what I'm surprised by, but
not a surprise, right?
Yeah, go on.
And also, I'm sorry, I should correct something from those 3 questions that came in. They were not from Dennis. They were from Sven. Thank you, Sven. Sorry about that. But Dennis does mention that the question about different schemas is a good one. I also should add that one thing which EBR functionality really lacks at the moment is good practical examples and master classes about the cases when EBR shines. Right. I believe you have loads of such practices. Yes. Thank you, Dennis.
Yes. So hopefully the example, I'm going to show you an example in a minute, and hopefully that will show you what I think is the easiest use case and probably the most common, at least when it comes to deploying PL SQL. Okay, so thanks for voting, everyone. If you still keep clicking yes or no on the little buttons in the participants window, if you haven't shared your vote so far. All right, then, so let's return. So edition-based redefinition, how does this actually help solve the problem? Well, prior to EBR, the fully qualified name of an object in a database was schema name dot object name. So that means you can only have one copy of an object with a particular name in a given schema. With EBR, the fully qualified name of an object is now edition name dot schema name dot object name. So what this means is we can have 2 copies of a particular named object. So we can have edition 1, schema Chris, customers package. Edition 2, schema Chris, another copy of that customers package, or something called customers. We could actually swap it from being a package to a procedure. You can change the object type between editions. So something to bear in mind there. So how does this work? What's the high level idea here? So let's return to that deployment we had, our 3 object application. So to start off with, we've got everything in edition 1. This is our currently live version. Customers are actually accessing it. We're going to do a release. So the first thing we need to do is create the new edition. We do that, create the new edition, and bang. At this point, we've now got a thin copy of all the objects in the schema. So these are basically just pointers back to the views, packages, and procedure in edition 1. If I go back into edition 1 and compile that view, we will see that change in edition 2. So these are just pointers. In order to make these real separate objects, we need to go into edition 2 and compile them. So first thing I'm going to do is going to change that view. I'm going to add the column to it. So I compile that. I've actualized it. I've compiled a copy of it. so it is now an independent object. So this process of actualizing is a very important concept. I'll discuss it a little bit more later on. So now we've got our edition 2. We're going to do another release, a third release, create new edition 3, bang. Again, we've got thin copies of everything, and I'm going to compile the procedures this time. That's all I'm changing. So I compile the procedure. So as things stand at the moment, package in edition 3 is really just a pointer all the way back to edition 1. The procedure in edition 2 is really just a pointer back to the procedure in edition 1. So keep this in mind. I'll discuss it a bit more because now, excuse me, I'm going to jump into a demo. Excuse me. Any questions or comments before I get the demo up and running?
Tadeo mentioned that the Fusion applications are currently uptaking EBR in a phased approach. That's right. One of the biggest users of EBR these days is Oracle itself in terms of our applications, and the Fusion apps have been burning in EBR over a period of time, and from what I understand, are very happy with the results.
Yep. Cool. Okay then. So for this demo, what I've got is very simple application here. It's just got a function and a procedure, and the function just returns hello with the database user, so we'll compile that, and the procedure just calls it and just DBMS outputs it. So we can run that, and it will say we're connected as EBR user or whatever. Yeah, hello EBR user. So there we go. So this runs it, calls that. Now I want to change this. So we've been using database users here, but really we want to pass in the application user. And of course, the database has no idea who these application users are. So what I want to do is add a parameter to this function. And just to kind of illustrate the principle, I'm going to do this as two separate releases. First up, I'm going to add a procedure to the function with a default parameter with a default value, and then in the second release I'm going to change the procedure to actually pass that parameter, a value for that parameter. Okay, so coming in, doing my first release, first thing I need to do is actually create the edition. So I've created the edition, and then optionally I might also need to grant use on this edition to the users we're going to be deploying the code in. So in order to be able to access editions, then you need to grant use on them. EBR users got full privileges, so I don't need to worry about it in this instance, but you may need to do this as part of your release. So at this point, we've now got 2 editions in the database. So we've got our $base, that default that comes with every release of Oracle from 11.2, and my release one that we've just created. And notice we got this like parent-child relationship. And a lot of people look at this and kind of go, parent-child relationship, that means like some kind of tree, right? So we could have some branching logic and different things going out here. No, you can't do that. Each edition can have at most 1 parent and 1 child. So it's not a tree at all, it's just a line. You know, it kind of looks a bit like a hierarchy, but it isn't really. It's just a straight line from the previous edition or down to the next edition. So we got that. How do we know which edition we're in? Well, we've got this syscontext, and we can call that. We see we're in $base. So I want to deploy my changes into release 1. So I actually need to change my session to actually use it. So I need to set the edition. And we do that, and we can see when we get the syscontext variable, it is in release 1. So we are in the correct edition to do our release. And now I will just deploy my PL/SQL changes as I would normally. So we've got a new parameter here, and passing that with a default, and returning that value. So we've recompiled that. Now, at this point, we've only changed the function here, hello user. We haven't changed the procedure. How can we see this? Well, a lot of dictionary views from 11.2 have a corresponding copy of it with this AE suffix, AE standing for all editions. So you can see which different editions objects exist in. And if we compile that, we can see, boop, boop, boom, we have got 2 versions of the function here. and only one version of the display user procedure. So we've only actualized the function, we haven't actualized the procedure. Now, what is not immediately apparent here is that we have in fact actually invalidated this procedure in the new edition. And when we call it, it will automatically validate itself because the code works. We've got a default parameter. So now we can see that we now have that procedure is actualized in this edition too. So we now have 2 copies of all the objects. So this is the process of actualizing, make them really exist in the new edition that we've created. So that was release 1. Now I'm going to do a second release. In reality, this would probably be 1 release, but just for the purposes of demo, I'm going to have a second release where I create another new edition. So release 2 again, and I might need to grant access to it. I'm going to set my edition to be that. And now I'm going to change the procedure to actually pass the value for the parameter in. So we'll do that, and we can see when it comes up that we now have a copy of that procedure in the new edition. We do not have a new copy of the function. Okay, and if I call this, we get the behavior, new behavior, we're passing the parameter in, and that's all working. If we look at which objects exist in which edition, we still only, in addition to, only have the procedure, not the function itself. And this is something which is easy to overlook when you first start doing this. If you make a change to an object which something else depends on, then you'll invalidate it, and when you come to access it, it'll recompile. So let's say this function actually references a view or a table or something like that. If we were to make a change to that, even a trivial safe change, something like granting or revoking access, we could invalidate this function, at which point we'll end up recompiling it in the new edition, which, if this is the live one and customers are accessing it, can bring a whole bunch of problems. You can get stuck in the situation where you've got the cascading invalidation and everything's trying to recompile and your whole application ends up in a big heap. Don't want to be in that situation. So what we need to do is go through and recompile all the objects in the new schema. So we do that, we've compiled it, and we can see we've got this function in release 2. So this is an important difference here. Typically, after PL SQL releases, you'll do a recompile of the invalid objects and only the invalid objects. With EBR, you want to recompile all the objects in the new edition. So, and this prevents you accidentally having cascading invalidations for some unknown reason. So it's really important when you've finished your release, you go through and recompile everything in the new edition, so it's all actualized. Okay, any questions or comments on that? No?
Chat space is quiet. Mesmerized by your demo.
Why? So, Dennis, why recompilation of all objects in the new edition not made automatically? So that's a good question, Dennis. So the first thing is creating the new edition makes them just pointers back to the previous one or whatever the prior one is for simplicity and performance reasons. It means it's just an instant operation. We don't have to create new versions of all the objects in the new edition. Because of course, the intention is, the idea behind it is you're actually going to change some things. So you don't really want a copy of them anyway. So you're going to go through and compile the things you're actually changing, and then should recompile the things that you're not. So it's to make that initial creation of the edition fast and lightweight. And of course, some point after that, we don't know, the database doesn't know when you've completed your release and when you're done making your changes in that new edition. So it's up to you to say, yep, I'm done now, recompile everything. Okay. Okay, what about recompiling all the dependencies of the changing object inside the new edition? So you mean only the dependencies? No, you still want to compile every single object you in that schema, because, as I said, let's say we've got another completely separate function, and it's not part of the dependencies for this procedure and parameter. That function calls a view, and so we don't recompile either of those. Later on, we do something which is typically seen as quite safe and run a grant or a revoke on that view. That then invalidates or could invalidate that function. And at that point, we need to recompile. Because we've invalidated it, we need to recompile it. And this can lead to a problem where you've just kind of, your whole application falls apart because you've issued a grant or something like that, and everything is now invalid, okay? Because you, in that new edition, for something unrelated, an unrelated release reason. Does that help answer the question? Okay, and while you let us know whether that's helping, Dennis, a question from Niels. Yep, so the parent of release 2 is automatically release 1. That's right, Niels. So if we go back up to where was DBA edition, where was the thing I had? There we go. We see parent of release 2 is release 1. So automatically, by default, when you create a new edition, its parent is whatever the current leaf is, whatever is the bottom of the chain. And you can't do anything other than that. I believe there is syntax which leads you to believe you can, but you can't. All right then. Yeah, so you're just saying you can also explicitly specify the parent. I guess that might be useful for something like if you want to ensure you'll ordered your releases in a particular way. Other than that, I'm not entirely sure. You don't need it, basically. If anyone's got any other insight on that, please let us know. Okay. All right. So let's move on. We've done our release. We've compiled everything. Everything's up and running. Now, one of the things that has not been clear is how you actually reference objects, reference the different editions. So I said the fully qualified name is now edition schema object. Sadly, you cannot explicitly reference what these editions are. All of these are going to fail because we cannot reference the edition. It is part of your session settings. If you want to change which edition you're using, you have to do an alter session like this. The key thing is only you can do the alter session. Only the owner of the session. You can't log in as sysdba or some other power user and force other sessions to a new edition. Only change it yourself within the edition. Okay. So the edition is part of your session session settings, so important thing to be aware of. And then it's saying if you can do that, you can create a tree, not a line. Being able to specify an edition leads you to believe you could create a tree. You absolutely cannot. The database won't let you. You'll get an exception. So let's stick with this. I've done the release and actually found out there was some problem in that procedure. We released the wrong thing or whatever, and we didn't want to do it. What do we do now? Well, few options. One is we could just leave it. We haven't made it available to customers. Just leave it there and then come back later and fix code, either deploy it into the same edition or deploy it to a new edition. Or we could revert the whole change, drop the edition and kind of go back and pretend it never happened. So we try and drop the edition. We do that, we'll see that the edition is in use. So if anyone is connected to it, you cannot use it. If any sessions have that property, you'll get an exception. So we need to go back to the previous one, drop the edition, and there we go, and it's gone. So I see there's a couple of other comments. Yes, can the edition also be specified at the connection level? Good question. there's various ways you can set it. So there's a JDBC connection property, there's environment variables, there's a whole stack of ways you can do it, basically. So you can set it as part of your connection settings. Okay, question, Dennis. Is it only possible to change PL SQL using EBR without downtime, or is it also possible with the schema and date changes? Let's imagine we dropped a column of table, added another one, and populated it. So how it all works with EBR and different editions of the table. Or is this just impossible to jail such changes in a safe edition? So it's a good question, Dennis. You can use EBR to manage schema changes as well. That is a more involved topic, and it's worthy of a session in its own right, really. So just wanted to focus on PL SQL for now because it's pretty straightforward. In terms of the release, you are doing it exactly as you would release your PL SQL currently, with the exception that you have a script to run at the start to create the edition and connect to it, do your release, and then the tidy up process is a bit different afterwards. You recompile everything instead of recompiling invalids, and you want to take some steps here as well at the end to stop people accessing the old edition. Yes, so great topic. I've got some more I'm going to cover on these things a little bit, so we'll come back to this. We'll see how we're doing for time. So after finishing the release, we're in release 1, we're happy that's fine. We now deprecated our base that's done with. We want to revoke access from it to make sure nobody accidentally connects to it and set the default edition for the database to the current release. So if nobody specifies the edition in some other way, we are connected to that. Okay. So yes, good point. Managing schema changes with EBR is certainly worth something of a session in its own right. All right then, let's move on. We're getting towards the hour. Now, hopefully you saw that and thought that's actually pretty straightforward. You know, when it comes to PL SQL changes, really, other than an extra script at the start and a slightly different process after the release, it is exactly the same way as you release PL SQL today. You know, assuming you make no table changes, you're just changing PL SQL, packages, procedures, views, object types, all just works. So you might go, well, hang on, surely there's a catch. So a couple of things to be aware of. First up, to use editions, you have to enable it at the schema level. So the first thing you need to do is alter user and enable editions, or editions enable it. This is a one-way operation. You cannot editions disable a user, so you can't roll that back. Or if you want to roll it back, you have to restore the user from some kind of backup, right? So first thing to be aware of, you cannot go backwards. Now, you might go, was this an issue? Yes, or maybe it is, maybe it isn't. This is going to touch on some of the things you're discussing here, Dennis, and so on. Not everything is editionable. So there are still some things you can only have one copy of in a given schema in a given database. They're primarily things that store data: tables, indexes, materialized views, and public synonyms in 11.2. These non-editionable objects that you can only have one copy cannot depend on an object that you have multiple copies of. So if you've got function-based indexes or virtual columns or materialized views which make use of your own PL SQL, potentially you're in trouble because they cannot do this. We've got something we can only have one copy of that can point to many things. Potentially, it's like, well, how does this work? So this is disallowed. And on 11.2, if you had a lot of these dependencies, you were kind of stuck, actually. Fortunately, we addressed it in 12c. So there's a couple of ways. There's syntax in virtual columns and the like to say this is only usable in this edition, or which edition the virtual column should use. Or you can say this specific package, we can still only have one copy of it. Okay, so you can isolate a particular package and make that non-editionable, just that package. All the other PL SQL, we can still have multiple copies of. So there's various ways to solve this in 12.2. So that's something to be aware of. But this is mostly a setup issue. The other thing you want to be aware of, and it's kind of one-time hit. Once you've sorted this out, then mostly you're okay. You need to be aware of it ongoing, but generally it's not too much of an issue. The other thing that's likely to catch you out, you've started using EBR, and instead of doing releases 2-3 times a year, you realize you can do releases, every week, or maybe even multiple times a week. You're going to start accumulating a large number of editions. You could have 50, 100 in a year, and a few thousand in a few years quite easily. As you get more and more of these editions, it becomes highly likely that at some point, someone's going to try and connect to the wrong edition, and things are not going to work the way expected. How can we address this? Well, this is where you need to be really hot on your processes. So going back to your question, Niels, about specifying the edition, you can specify it in the connection string in various ways. So like say JDBC connection property. Also, you could use, if you're using services, lots of good reasons you should use database services anyway. If you're using those, you can bind a service to an edition. And if you've got anything which for some reason you can't use services and you can't easily change the connection settings, then you set the default edition to the database. So if nothing else is stated, come into that. So specify this, and you can make this part of your configuration for your application. Set the application, the edition we're going to connect to. Next thing is revoke access from those old editions. Revoke use. So if someone does accidentally try to connect to the wrong edition, either because it's in the connect string or an alter session, they'll get an exception and be told, you shouldn't be using this. So once we've done a release, it's done, we're a few releases on, revoke access from them so people don't accidentally connect to them. So make sure you do this. Otherwise, at some point, someone will try and connect in and be like, what's going on? Why is not everything not working? Yeah. Yes. So, okay, so I see there's several comments coming in here. Sven, my recommendation, Dennis, is to do different releases. Use editions for minor releases where you change only code or add tables, but where you do no DDL that breaks existing code. Do major releases where you still have downtime. Add DDL functionality that breaks one to such major releases. Yeah, I think that's a good idea there, Sven. So I think a lot of people see EBR and see you can use it to manage schema changes and kind of go, I've got to do all this crazy stuff. I don't know what I'm doing. The point I'm making here is you can use it to manage just your PL SQL changes, and you can manage DDL separately. It's worth remembering that things like creating a table, altering a table to add a nullable column, and so on, these are basically pretty safe operations. And you can do them without an outage anyway. New table's a new thing, nothing's referencing it, so we can create it. If there's a problem, who cares? When it comes to more complex DDL, EBR is there to help you, but as a starting point, if you just use it to manage your PL SQL, you can still get a lot of benefits, a lot of agility without having to go, full EBR. Okay, so some other comments. So, Dennis, we need examples of the most practical cases of using EBR. This is a great feature which is still frightening for people because of the absence of good, successful examples and stories, at least I think so. Okay, so to answer that, Dennis, a couple of things. Hopefully, I've shown that for PL SQL, this is pretty easy, and it's very minimal change that you need to do to your release processes. And in fact, you could almost get away without your developers even knowing that you're using it. I wouldn't recommend that, but you could almost get away without people even knowing it's there to some degree. I wouldn't go ahead and just blindly do it and not tell anyone, but in terms of how you develop and how you do your PL SQL releases, it just works, right? In terms of successful examples and stories, so this, as we said, Tadeo is just saying Fusion Apps are using this. eBusiness Suite was actually the customer that this was developed for. So eBusiness Suite uses this extensively. American Express has said that they use this to do daily releases of the PL SQL. I think I saw Oren earlier, and maybe he's here. He works for a company, Move It, who do use this as well. So there are those are some of the publicly things that we know about people using it. So we are definitely using this internally in Oracle, and will continue to do so. And there are some big customers out there who do use it as well. So if you want to know more, Dennis, then just reach out to us, and we can probably get to know it more. Okay, I think we're coming up on the hour, and that's pretty much all I wanted to say. Cover most of the stuff. As I say, the table schema changes stuff, more complicated. We'll have to have a future session to discuss that. In summary, the goal here is zero downtime. However, you still need some infrastructure above it, like a load balancer, to actually manage true zero downtime for your releases, even when using EBR. However, what it can help you do is shrink your outage windows. Instead of having to schedule an outage at some silly hour in the morning when nobody wants to be awake, you can do your release during the day while everyone is in the office, right? Your applications can still be running. You can do your release, check it's worked, do your live testing on your real application while the thing is running. And then maybe you will just have a brief outage overnight. But instead of an extended 3 or 4 hours to ensure you can do your release and window to roll it back as well, it's just a couple of minutes you need to get everyone to reconnect to the new edition. And a lot of businesses can tolerate that, a couple of minutes, maybe even every night. So even if you don't need zero downtime, I still think this is absolutely worth doing, because it makes it much easier or much safer to deploy PL SQL. Absolutely, I recommend you do it. I say this came in 11.2. There's a lot of enhancements in 12c which make it a lot easier. So if you've got lots of things like virtual columns which reference your PL SQL, generally the easiest approach is just to upgrade to 12c. If you don't have those dependencies, 11.2 is fine. Have you got something to say, Stephen?
I was just going to say we've got some lengthy questions from Dennis.
Yes.
First, is it possible to do cherry picking of changes with EBR? An example, we have a task 1, task 2, and task 3 that lead to some different changes. Now we need to deploy only the changes for task 1 and task 3. So in conventional programming, this is solved by different VCS branches and merging them on the trunk. Is it possible to achieve something similar with Oracle DB and EBR?
I think this is a question which pretty much everyone has about EBR when they start learning about it. Yeah, so as Sven says, EBR is not a version control system. You can't use this to branch and merge your code in the database. There is no tree. You can only, it's just a line, and it's still up to you to figure out how you're deploying those changes. So this is something Bryn was absolutely adamant about. You should only have at most 2 editions active or usable at a particular time. The live one your customers are using, and the one that you are deploying your changes to, and then both of them while you're in a cutover. So most of the time you'll only have 1 edition active. I could see that maybe, particularly if you're doing kind of rolling releases, which overlap somewhat, you might have 2 or 3 of these active as you gradually pushing more and more releases out. But if you've got a lot of live editions, you're going to start running into issues. It's going to have complications, and you're going to get bitten at some point. And this is speaking from experience. So it is not a version control system in the database. Do not think about it. Try and do that. Okay. Next point you say. Like we have 3 different editions, 1 for current state, 1 for task 1 changes, 1 for task 3, then we need to merge all the changes to the new current state, but we only have a line addition. Presume the answer is no. Yes. Yeah. It'd be a nice feature, if everyone asks for it. This was that. Yeah, I know a lot of people ask for it. I think there's a lot of practical challenges of that. If you're talking about merging code in the database, yeah. short answer is it's not going to happen anytime soon.
And perhaps the bit longer answer is our biggest challenge right now is getting folks up and running and using the basics of EBR. And I suppose you can sometimes argue that some of these edge cases or a few more features would make the difference, and then people would start using it. And I guess we just have to evaluate those and see. But I'd say our main challenge right now is probably more to what you'd mentioned earlier, which is having good examples, use cases, and demonstrations for people.
Yeah. Okay. We're a little past the hour, but I can hang around if people still want to chat. So if you've got any more questions, let us know. Just out of interest, did people find this useful? Have I convinced anyone to actually give EBR a try? Or what do people think? Yeah. We're dying for a session on EBR schema changes. Okay.
They just can't get enough on EBR, Chris.
Yeah, okay,
cool.
All right.
We'll
then.
do that.
Yeah, we'll have to do that. We'll have to do that. Yeah, I'll cover it. We'll do a separate session at some point covering schema changes then. Yeah. Gonna break production down and see if it works. Go for it.
That's the spirit.
Yeah, God. Recommendation from Sven. EBNOR, edition-based, not only redefinition. Start using EBR on day one in the project. Aim for low but not zero downtime. Avoid complex cross-edition logic. Develop and test the same database in different editions. I think that's some good advice there, Sven. Kevin, I'm in management, not so much.
And Sven, didn't you also publish a blog post with your EBNOR suggestions? Okay.
Yeah. I think, like I say, if you focus this just on PL SQL, if you think about it as a way to be able to more safely do PL SQL releases with no outage during normal working hours, when everyone's fresh and happy and not worried about not drinking 10 cups of coffee just to make sure everything works properly, so they can stay awake and ensure they press the right buttons. I think that's a good way to sell it.
Thanks for sticking around, everybody.
Yes.
Glad you enjoyed the session. Thank you, Chris, for putting it together and for carrying forth the torch of EBR.
Yes. Alrighty then. I guess we will head off then.
Take care, everybody. Happy coding.
Yep. Cheerio. Bye.